Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Shetler, and I'm a graduate student at Houston Christian University. And today I'm presenting my final exegetical PowerPoint for Exegesis Component 5. It's for class CHRI 5305 B02, Theological Inquiry with Dr. Robert Bugg. This presentation will focus on a comparative analysis of Luke 11:33 through 36. Most translations include verse 33. The lamp of the body, and Matthew 6:22 through 23, Sermon on the Mount, and the heading Treasures in Heaven. These two biblical passages that share common themes yet exhibit distinct details. To guide our discussion, we'll explore 5 key questions. How does Luke's version of the saying relate to Matthew's version? What historical background is essential for understanding the saying? What would Jesus' audience have understood this teaching differently compared to Luke's audience? What was the original meaning of Jesus' statement within its first century context? And 5, how can modern believers apply this teaching in today's world, given the differences between ancient and contemporary contexts? Throughout this presentation, we will examine the biblical text carefully, considering the literary and historical contexts, and seek to uncover their theological significance. Introduction. Comparison of Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36. Introduction to the study. Before we begin our study in exegesis, we'll read 2 key texts. Matthew 6:22 through 23 of the NRSV. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is this darkness? Luke 11:33 through 36, NRSV. No one after lighting a lamp puts it in a cellar, but on the lampstand, so that those who enter may see the light. Your eye is the lamp of your body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But if it is unhealthy, your body is full of darkness. Therefore consider whether the light in you is not darkness. If then your whole body is full of light, with no part of it in darkness, it will be as full of light as when a lamp gives you light with its rays. Key points to consider before our study. Jesus uses the eye as a metaphor for spiritual perception. A healthy eye represents clarity, generosity, and alignment with God's truth. A bad, evil eye symbolizes greed, selfishness, and spiritual blindness. These passages challenge us to examine our inner vision, how we perceive truth, wealth, and righteousness. And Luke's version expands on the metaphor by connecting it to shining light for others. Point 1 of comparison of Matthew 6:22 and 23 versus Luke 11:33 through 36. In this slide, we'll highlight the key takeaway from our comparison. Both passages emphasize the idea of one's inner perception determines spiritual condition, but they are framed differently by Matthew and Luke. Matthew presents this teaching as a call to undivided devotion, urging believers to prioritize God over material wealth. Luke frames it as a prophetic warning, cautioning against spiritual blindness and the rejection of divine truth. This distinction reflects how oral traditions of Jesus' teachings were adapted by different gospel writers to fit their theological and narrative purposes. And to better understand these differences, we analyze these passages through 3 critical approaches. Form criticism examines the oral tradition and genre. Matthew treats this as a wisdom saying or on devotion to God. And Luke presents it as both a wisdom teaching and a prophetic warning against rejecting Jesus. Literary criticism looks at structure and context. In Matthew, this passage is part of Jesus' ethical teachings on wealth and priorities in the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it is placed in a warning about rejecting Jesus' light and reinforcing the urgency of spiritual awareness. Grammatical criticism analyzes word meanings and syntax. Matthew uses the Greek word haplos, meaning single or undivided, emphasizing focus and devotion. And Luke uses kalos for good and paneros for evil, creating a strong moral contrast between embracing or rejecting life. These differences demonstrate how each gospel writer shaped Jesus' teachings to address their specific audiences and theological themes. Point 2 of comparison of Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 through 23. Reader response criticism. Matthew's audience likely interprets the passage as a moral exhortation, emphasizing wealth, material distractions, and spiritual focus. Luke's audience may see it as a call to spiritual awareness, highlighting the necessity of accepting Christ as the true life. Traditional criticism. Matthew's version aligns with Jewish wisdom literature, particularly ethical teachings on devotion to God versus material wealth. Luke's version carries apocalyptic and prophetic overtones, warning against spiritual blindness and rejection of Jesus' revelation. Redaction criticism. Matthew integrates this teaching into the Sermon on the Mount, reinforcing this theme of ethical righteousness and wholehearted devotion to God. And Luke places it within a different narrative context, connecting it to Jesus' broader warning about rejecting divine truth. His expansion in verse 36 underscores the metaphor of being completely full of light. Comparison point number 3. Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 and 23. Key takeaways. Theological interpretation. Matthew emphasizes personal holiness and moral clarity, teaching that a healthy eye reflects devotion to God, while a bad eye represents spiritual corruption and greed. Luke focuses on spiritual openness to divine revelation, warning that those who reject Christ remain in darkness, while those who accept him are spiritually illuminated. Canonical criticism. Both passages use the imagery of light and darkness, but Matthew connects it to righteous living. See Proverbs 4:18 through 19 and Matthew 5:14 through 16, and warns against materialism, as seen in Matthew 6:24. Luke aligns with themes of Jesus as the divine light, as seen in John 1:5 and John 8:12. And this echoes Isaiah 42 verses 6 through 7, where God's servant brings light to the nations. Historical criticism. In Matthew's Jewish context, the evil eye was a common idiom for greed, envy, or selfishness. See Proverbs 28 verse 22 and Deuteronomy 15:9, reinforcing Jesus' warning against materialism. Luke's Greco-Roman audience would have understood the lamp on a stand metaphor as a wisdom and knowledge symbol, linking spiritual blindness to rejecting divine truth. Comparison point number 4. Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 through 23. Key takeaways. Structuralism. Both passages use binary oppositions, light versus darkness. Matthew emphasizes an ethical contrast, greed versus devotion, and Luke presents a theological contrast, accepting versus rejecting Christ's revelation. Luke expands the metaphor with the lamp to stress illumination through faith in Christ. In the ancient Near Eastern, the evil eye was a well-known concept in Jewish and ancient Near Eastern cultures. In Jewish tradition, it represented greed, envy, and selfishness. Light versus darkness was a central theme in apocalyptic literature and mystery religions. Luke's metaphor of letting in the light may have resonated with both Jewish and Greco-Roman audiences familiar with illumination motifs. Introduction. Historical background. Essential to understanding. Understanding the historical and cultural context is key to fully grasping Jesus' teaching. Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36 reference concepts that were familiar to a first century Jewish audience. And to interpret these passages correctly, one must consider the metaphorical language Jesus used and how it related to common beliefs about light, vision, and spiritual insight. Historical background. Point number one, Jewish understanding of the healthy and evil eye. Understanding the historical and cultural context is crucial for interpreting Jesus' words in Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36. In Jewish thought, the eye was linked to a person's moral and spiritual condition. A healthy eye, in Greek, is haplos, symbolized generosity and sincerity, and a bad eye, in Greek, paneros, represented greed and envy and selfishness. Reference Proverbs 28:22 and Deuteronomy 15:9. Interpretation and application. Jesus' Jewish audience would have understood that he was warning against greed and materialism. This connects to the teaching on storing treasures in heaven, as we see in Matthew 6:19 through 21, and spiritual vision, how one perceives wealth, generosity, and devotion to God determines their moral state. Point number two on historical background. Light and darkness in Jewish and Greco-Roman thought. Light and darkness in Jewish thought. The metaphor of light versus darkness was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, symbolizing wisdom versus ignorance, righteousness versus sin, divine truth versus deception. See Isaiah 42 verses 6 through 7, which speaks of God's servant, often interpreted as our Messiah, bringing light to the nations and opening blind eyes, pointing to spiritual awakening. Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran community. The Essenes, a Jewish sect, wrote about a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. This reflects Jewish apocalyptic thought, where light symbolizes divine revelation and darkness represents rejection of truth. Light and darkness in Greco-Roman thought. Greek and Roman cultures also used light-related imagery, often linking it to wisdom, knowledge, and divine guidance. In Plato's allegory of the cave, as we see in Plato's The Republic, Plato compares ignorance to living in darkness and enlightenment to seeing the light. In Stoicism, it's taught that moral clarity was like a lamp guiding one's actions in an ethical life. How this affects interpretation? Well, in Matthew's version, it emphasizes that if one's moral vision is corrupt, focused on greed, their whole life will be full of spiritual darkness and ruin. In Luke's version, it highlights how Jesus has the light that people must either accept or reject. Luke's audience, including Gentiles, would have connected this imagery to both Jewish and apocalyptic themes and the Greek philosophical traditions that valued enlightenment. Closing thought. The themes of light and darkness in both Jewish and Greco-Roman thought reinforce the significance of Jesus' teaching, whether through Jewish apocalyptic expectations or Greek philosophical insights. Light symbolizes truth, wisdom, and divine revelation. Jesus challenges, and he challenges his audience and us to examine our spiritual sight. Are you walking in the light of God's truth, or are we blinded by ignorance, greed, or rejection of his message? True enlightenment comes not just from knowledge, but from embracing Christ as the ultimate source of light. Historical background, point number three. Placement of the sayings in Matthew and Luke's Gospel. Redaction history. Found in the Sermon on the Mount, a discourse on righteousness, devotion, and materialism. Followed by Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. This reinforces the idea that the eye metaphor is about one's attitude toward wealth and devotion to God. And the placement in Luke's Gospel is found in a section discussing signs and rejecting Jesus' message, Luke 11:29 through 32. In context comes after Jesus rebukes those demanding a sign, emphasizing that they already have enough light to believe but refuse to see. Luke 11:36 is unique to Luke's account, shifting focus to the total transformation that happens when someone fully accepts Jesus' revelation. How this affects interpretation. Matthew's audience, the Jewish Christians, would have understood the healthy eye as a call to generosity and undivided devotion to God. Luke's audience, including the Gentiles, would have seen the light within you as a call to accept Jesus, teaching and avoiding spiritual blindness. Closing thought. These two gospel placements show that Jesus' teaching on spiritual sight is both practical and theological. It's about how we handle wealth and devotion, as in Matthew, but also whether we truly see and accept Jesus as the light, as seen in Luke. The challenge for us today is to examine our own hearts. Are we allowing God's light to fill us, or are we clinging to the darkness? Historical background. Point number 4. Economic and social context of first century Palestine. Economic disparity. Society had a vast gap between the rich and the poor, and many of Jesus' followers were poor, oppressed, or burdened by Roman taxation. Wealth and religious views. Wealth was often seen as a sign of God's favor, and Jesus challenged this mindset, warning against greed, materialism, and misplaced trust in wealth. Almsgiving in Jewish tradition. Giving to the poor was considered an act of righteousness. The contrast between a generous eye and a selfish eye reflects one's heart and devotion to God. How this affects interpretation. Matthew's Gospel challenges the belief that wealth signifies righteousness. It warns that greed corrupts one's spiritual vision, leading to darkness. In Luke's Gospel, it ties spiritual blindness to rejecting Jesus' message, reinforces that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor and open-hearted. Closing thought. Jesus' teaching on wealth and generosity calls believers to examine their hearts. A spiritually healthy life isn't measured by material success, but by generosity, humility, and a clear vision fixed on God's kingdom. Historical background, conclusion. Key takeaways. Historical factors to consider. The Jewish understanding of the eye. Light versus darkness in Jewish and Greco-Roman thought. Gospel context and audience. First century economic and social context. Matthew 6:22 through 23, the spiritual vision and wealth. A healthy eye represents generosity and righteousness, while an evil eye symbolizes greed and selfishness. Light signifies spiritual clarity and moral integrity, while darkness reflects corrupt desires, especially greed. In context, in Matthew's Gospel, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount, emphasizing wealth and devotion to God. Jewish listeners would recognize the evil eye as an idiom for greed. Challenges materialism in a culture that equated wealth with God's blessing. In Luke 11:33 through 36, the spiritual sight in Jesus' message. Less emphasis on wealth and focusing instead on openness to God's truth. Light represents Jesus' revelation and divine wisdom, while darkness reflects the rejection of his teaching. In context, in Luke's gospel, it's placed in a passage addressing skepticism towards Jesus' signs, and appeals to both Jewish and Gentile audiences, warning against spiritual blindness. It criticizes religious elites and skeptics who reject Jesus' message. In conclusion, understanding Jewish idioms, the symbolism of light and darkness, and first century economic conditions deepens our interpretation of these passages. In Matthew's version, it highlights how spiritual vision shapes one's devotion to God, particularly in matters of wealth and righteousness. In Luke's version, it focuses on recognizing and accepting Jesus as a source of divine truth. Closing thought. True spiritual sight comes from aligning our hearts with God's truth. Whether through generosity, humility, or embracing Jesus' teachings, our ability to see clearly determines how we walk in faith. Introduction. Differences in meaning for Jesus' audience versus Luke's audience. In Luke 11:33 through 36 and its parallel in Matthew 6:22 through 23, Jesus uses the metaphor of the eye as the lamp of the body. However, the way his words were understood differed between his original audience and Luke's audience. Differences in cultural, religious, and social context. Jesus' original audience was the first century Jew. Jesus' Jewish audience would have been familiar with the concept of light and darkness as spiritual metaphors from the Hebrew scriptures. See Psalm 119, verse 105, and Isaiah 60, verses 1 and 2. For them, the healthy eye symbolized a heart devoted to God, while the unhealthy eye symbolized greed, selfishness, and spiritual blindness. Light was understood as a metaphor for purity, divine truth, and righteousness, while darkness often represented sin, ignorance, and evil. In Luke's audience, the Greco-Roman world, Luke's audience was primarily the Gentiles and would have had different associations with light and darkness. They may have connected these ideas more to philosophical or moral teachings on knowledge and enlightenment. The concept of the eye as a moral indicator would resonate with ideas in Greco-Roman philosophy, where the eye was often seen as reflecting one's inner character and moral clarity. Luke's inclusion of this teaching would emphasize the need for inner transformation and alignment with divine truth in broader, more universal sense. Closing thought. While the metaphor of the healthy versus unhealthy eye carries deep spiritual significance in both contexts, the way it was understood by Jesus' original audience and Luke's audience sheds light on the different ways cultural, religious, and social backgrounds shape our interpretation of Scripture. Differences. Point number 1. Jesus' original audience, the first century Jewish listeners in Palestine. Key factors. Predominantly Jewish. Jesus' original listeners were mainly Jewish peasants, religious leaders, and disciples, all deeply immersed in Jewish culture and religious practices. Familiar with Jewish wisdom literature, they would have recognized the metaphor of the healthy eye and evil eye as common Jewish idioms, symbolizing generosity versus greed, as we see in Proverbs 28:22 and Deuteronomy 15:9. Expectation of the Messiah. Many in Jesus' audience were expecting a political Messiah who would free them from Roman oppression. Instead, Jesus focused on spiritual transformation, calling people to a deeper relationship with God. Cultural context. Wealth and God's favor. Wealth was often perceived as a sign of God's blessing, and Jesus challenged this belief by teaching that true wealth was found in spiritual devotion and generosity, not in material riches. Light versus darkness. The concept of light and darkness was common in Jewish apocalyptic thought, where light symbolized divine truth. Goodness, while darkness represented ignorance, sin, and evil. See the Dead Sea Scrolls in Isaiah 9:2. How they likely understood the saying. Matthew's version 6:22 through 23. The original audience likely understood it as a moral teaching about devotion to God, generosity, and the importance of avoiding greed, emphasizing spiritual clarity and righteousness. In Luke's version, Luke 11:33 through 36, Luke's audience would have understood it as a call to spiritual awareness and a challenge to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, accepting his teachings as a path to spiritual life. Resistance from religious leaders. Those resistant to Jesus, such as the Pharisees, scribes, and skeptics, would have heard this saying as a rebuke. For them, rejecting Jesus was seen as choosing spiritual blindness, a choice for darkness over light. Closing thought. Jesus' teachings, particularly regarding the healthy eye and evil eye, were not just cultural reflections. They were invitations to radically rethink spiritual priorities. For his Jewish audience, this was a call to move beyond materialism and embrace spiritual transformation. The challenge remains for us today to choose the light of Christ over the darkness of worldly desires and spiritual blindness. Differences. Point number 2. Luke's audience, primarily Gentile Christians in the Greco-Roman world. Key factors. More diverse audience. Luke's audience was primarily Gentile Christians, many of whom had converted from pagan backgrounds, alongside some Jewish Christians who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Less familiar with Jewish idioms. The phrase evil eye would not have the same immediate connection to greed for Gentiles as it did for Jews, who were familiar with Jewish wisdom literature. However, the light and darkness metaphor would resonate more strongly due to Greek philosophical traditions, which often associated light with truth and knowledge. Roman imperial context. Many Gentiles were involved in pagan mystery religions that emphasized illumination and spiritual enlightenment, drawing parallels to the concept of receiving divine truth. In a society dominated by emperor worship and polytheism, Gentiles were accustomed to competing religious claims, making the exclusive claim of Christ as the light a powerful message. How they likely understood the saying? Less about material wealth and more about spiritual enlightenment. Many Gentiles would not interpret this saying as addressing material greed versus generosity, but rather as a message about moral and spiritual clarity. They may have connected Jesus' words to philosophical ideas about knowledge and truth, such as Plato's concept of the light of reason, or the enlightenment that comes through knowledge. A warning against rejecting Christ's truth. Luke emphasizes Jesus as the light. His Gentile audience would likely see this saying as a call to fully embrace Christ and his teachings. Those who resist the gospel were seen as choosing darkness, ignorance, and sin, or continuing in their pagan practices rather than the light of salvation and truth in Christ. Application to their daily lives. Many Gentile Christians lived in a world of persecution and competing worldviews. This passage would serve as a reminder to remain spiritually pure and avoid being swayed back into idolatry or sinful behaviors that they had once practiced. Closing thought. For Luke's Gentile audience, the metaphor of light and darkness was not just about material wealth, but about the contrast between truth and ignorance, salvation and sin. And Jesus' call to embrace the light was a call to spiritual clarity and moral purity in a world filled with competing ideologies. Conclusion. Differences in meaning for Jesus' audience versus Luke's audience. Aspect. Cultural background. Jesus' original audience, the first century Jews in Palestine, primarily Jewish familiar with Torah and wisdom literature. They were deeply connected to Jewish idioms, customs, and expectations of the Messiah. In Luke's audience, the Greco-Roman Christians, were Gentile converts from pagan or philosophical traditions, exposed to various religious beliefs, including mystery religions and philosophical ideas about truth and knowledge. An understanding of the eye metaphor. Jesus' audience, the metaphor of the healthy eye versus the evil eye would be understood as a reflection of generosity versus greed, rooted in Jewish wisdom teachings. In Luke's audience, the metaphor would have been interpreted more as a moral clarity versus corruption, focusing on how one's perception of truth shapes their life. Understanding of light versus darkness. Jesus' audience, the Jewish listeners, would connect light and darkness with apocalyptic themes, symbolizing good versus evil, God versus Satan, and spiritual clarity versus blindness. In Luke's audience, Gentile Christians would connect light and darkness with philosophical themes of truth versus ignorance and the need for spiritual enlightenment through Christ. The primary message heard in Jesus' audience, a warning against greed, materialism, and spiritual blindness, encouraging trust in God over wealth and the pursuit of righteousness. In Luke's audience, a call to fully accept Christ's light, reject spiritual deception, and embrace the truth of Christ, leaving behind pagan beliefs and philosophies. Application. Jesus' audience would embrace righteousness, trust God over marital wealth, and live in a life of devotion to Him. And Luke's audience would reject spiritual deception, embrace the truth of Christ, and remain committed to the light of Christ in a world filled with competing beliefs. Conclusion. While Jesus' original Jewish audience would have understood the eye metaphor as a call to generosity and single-hearted devotion to God, Luke's audience, consisting of Gentile Christians, would have seen it more as a call to spiritual enlightenment and truth through Christ. Luke's version emphasizes the urgency of accepting Jesus and his message in the light of Christ, while Matthew's version focuses more on the importance of righteousness and living in alignment with God's will in daily life. Closing thought. Both audiences, though culturally and religiously distinct, are called to examine what they focus on, the light of Christ or the darkness of sin. The challenge is for us today is the same, to let our eyes be healthy, reflecting the light of God's truth, and to walk in the light of Christ, rejecting anything that leads us into darkness. Historical context, point number 1. The healthy eye and the evil eye in Jewish thought. The eye is a conduit reflecting light. In Jewish thought, the eye was seen not only as a physical organ, but a window to the soul. The way one looked at the world and others reflected their inner spiritual and moral state. The healthy eye, or haplos in the Greek, a generous and clear-sighted eye, symbolizing moral integrity, sincerity, and openness. In the evil eye, or paneros in the Greek, a corrupted, selfish, and envious eye, representing greed, jealousy, and a hardened heart. Meaning in Jewish thought. The healthy eye represents generosity, sincerity, and moral compass that seeks to do good for others, where the evil eye represents selfishness, greed, envy, and inward focus that only sees the world in terms of personal gain. Biblical examples. We see in Proverbs 22:9, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Deuteronomy 15:9. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites. In Proverbs 28:22, the stingy are eager to get rich and are unaware that poverty awaits them. Application in first century context. Jesus' Jewish audience would have immediately recognized the symbolism of the healthy eye and a call to generosity in a life devoted to God, rather than to material wealth. Matthew 6:19 through 21. Jesus' teaching, not only storing up treasures on earth but in heaven, directly connect with the imagery of the healthy eye, a clear, generous heart, and the evil eye, self-centered, materialistic focus. Jesus contrasts righteous living, the good eye, with the selfishness and greed seen in the evil eye. Closing thought. The eye acts as a conduit, revealing the state of our hearts by reflecting the light within us. What we choose to focus on, whether it's generosity or selfishness, shapes how we engage with the world. A healthy eye allows God's light to shine through, leading us toward righteousness and wholehearted devotion to Him. On the other hand, an evil eye distorts that light, clouding our vision with greed, envy, and materialism. And Jesus calls us to cultivate a clear eye, on that reflects His light and draws us into deeper generosity and commitment to His will. Ultimately, the condition of our eyes, what we value and prioritize, reveal the true condition of our hearts. Are we reflecting light generously and moral clarity, or are we veiled by selfishness and envy? Jesus invites us to live with a healthy eye, focused on His kingdom, where spiritual wealth far outweighs earthly possessions. Historical context, point number 2. Light and darkness as spiritual metaphors. Light symbolizes truth, wisdom, and divine presence. Darkness represents sin, ignorance, and rejection of God's revelation. And seeing the light signifies spiritual awakening and acceptance of truth. The Jewish perspective. Light is seen as God's presence, wisdom, and guidance, as we see in Isaiah 9:2. And darkness is seen as sin, ignorance, and separation from God. Wisdom of Solomon 17:1-3. The Messianic hope. The coming of the Messiah brings light to those in spiritual darkness. The Dead Sea Scrolls, sons of light versus sons of darkness. And the Greco-Roman perspective. Light, symbol of knowledge, enlightenment, and virtue in philosophy. See Plato's allegory of the cave. Darkness was seen as ignorance, false beliefs, and moral confusion. Moral clarity was seen as gaining wisdom and aligning with divine truth. Application in the first century context. Luke presents light versus darkness as a metaphor for spiritual vision and perception. And Jesus' words serve as a rebuke to those rejecting his message. Gentiles in Luke's audience, familiar with the philosophical ideas of enlightenment, would have recognized the significance of Jesus as the ultimate source of truth and wisdom. Closing thought. Jesus' teaching on light and darkness is a timeless call to self-examination. Are we allowing God's truth to illuminate our hearts, or are we remaining in spiritual blindness? True transformation begins when we open our eyes to Christ, the light of the world, and let Him guide our path. Historical context, point number 3. Economic and social context of first century Palestine. Factor. Extreme wealth, inequality, heavy taxation, Roman and temple taxes, and corruption among religious leaders. Impact on Jesus' audience. A small elite controlled most of the land and resources, and many peasants struggled to survive under financial burdens, leading to frustration and economic despair. Pharisees and Sadducees were often accused of exploiting the poor. How it relates to the passage. The evil eye represented greed, a major issue in first century society, and Jesus calls for trust in God rather than hoarding wealth. In Luke's version, Jesus criticizes materialism and spiritual blindness. Application in the first century context. The healthy eye represents those who trust God and share with the poor. The evil eye symbolizes greedy individuals and corrupt leaders who hoard wealth instead of helping others. Jesus challenges both the wealthy and the religious elites to embrace generosity. Closing thought. Jesus' teachings confront a system built on greed and exploitation, calling his followers to a radically different way of life, one marked by trust in God, generosity, and care for the oppressed. His words remain just as relevant today, urging us to examine where we place our trust and how we steward what we have. Historical context, point number 4. Placement in Matthew versus Luke and its first century meaning. Matthew 6:22 through 23. Historical context. Part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus warns against materialism and divided devotion. Its meaning for first century audience. It was a call to single-minded devotion to God rather than wealth. The eye represents spiritual focus, either directed toward God and righteousness or greed and worldly gain. In Luke 11:33 through 36, we see the historical context as following Jesus condemning those who demand signs. See Luke 11:29 through 32, which emphasize the need for spiritual recognition. And the meaning for the first century audience, it was a call to spiritual openness, those rejecting Jesus and choosing spiritual darkness. The eye represented one's ability to perceive truth. Those who fail to recognize Jesus remain spiritually blind. Closing thought. While both accounts use the eye as a metaphor, Matthew's version focuses on devotion versus greed, while Luke's account emphasizes spiritual sight versus blindness. In both cases, Jesus' call or calls people to open their eyes to the truth, whether that means seeking God over wealth or recognizing Jesus as the true light. Next, we'll summarize the historical meaning of these passages before exploring their modern application. Historical context conclusion. Main theme. Jesus uses the eye as a metaphor for spiritual clarity and moral integrity. The contrast between light and darkness illustrates the importance of right perspective in one's relationship with God. Matthew's account, in Matthew 6:22 through 23, focuses on the choice between God and wealth, a healthy eye, and represents righteousness, generosity, and devotion to God, while an evil eye symbolizes greed and materialism. Jesus calls his followers to serve God wholeheartedly rather than being consumed by earthly riches. And Luke's account, in Luke 11:33 through 36, emphasizes spiritual awareness versus blindness, recognizing Jesus as the light. A healthy eye means accepting Jesus and living in his truth, while a darkened eye represents rejection of Christ and spiritual ignorance. Closing thoughts. In the first century context, Jesus' words challenged people to choose between light and darkness, righteousness and sin, devotion to God or worldly pursuits. These same choices remain relevant today, shaping how believers view and interact with the world. In this next section, we will talk about this next question and topic. How do these teachings apply in a modern world filled with distractions, materialism, and shifting values? And we'll explore practical applications for believers today. Modern application, introduction. Jesus' teachings in Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36 were spoken in a first century Jewish context, but their message is still highly relevant today. While in the cultural, economic, and technological landscape has changed, the spiritual principles remain the same. Key takeaway. Just as in the ancient world, spiritual clarity and moral integrity are essential for living a Christ-centered life. Believers today must interpret and apply these teachings in a world influenced by consumerism, digital distractions, and shifting moral values. In this next slide, we'll discuss the following question and topic. How do these principles apply to modern challenges like materialism, social comparison, and selfish ambition? In the next slide, we'll explore practical ways to develop a healthy eye in today's world. Modern application, point number one, the healthy eye and the evil eye in a modern context. Ancient meaning. In Jesus' time, a healthy eye represented generosity and moral integrity, a perspective aligned with God's righteousness. The evil eye symbolized greed, envy, and selfishness, leading to spiritual darkness. Modern application. Today, having a healthy eye means maintaining a kingdom focused mindset, prioritizing eternal values over material gain. Modern challenges, consumerism, social media, comparison, and selfish ambition can distort our spiritual vision, and believers must be vigilant to guard their hearts against these influences. Practical application. Generosity versus materialism. Society encourages wealth accumulation and self centered success, but Jesus calls us to invest in eternal treasures, helping the poor, serving others, sharing the gospel. Contentment versus envy. Social media fuels envy and dissatisfaction, making people feel like they never have enough. A healthy eye focuses on God's blessings and provision rather than longing for what others have. Closing thought. Just as Jesus taught us, our spiritual vision impacts our walk with God. When we focus on generosity, integrity, and gratitude, we walk in the light, free from the blindness of greed and envy. Modern application, point number two, light and darkness as a spiritual metaphor today. Ancient meaning. Light symbolized God's wisdom, truth, and righteousness, and darkness represented sin, ignorance, and rejecting God. Modern application. In a world of moral relativism and misinformation, Jesus' call to walk in the light means following biblical truth despite cultural pressures. Many today are spiritually blind, prioritizing secular ideologies, self fulfillment, or power over truth. Practical application. Spiritual discernment. In an era of false teaching, secular philosophies, and distractions, Christians must develop spiritual vision by staying rooted in Scripture. Shining the light. Believers are called to be a light in the world, Matthew 5:14, sharing the gospel, showing love, and standing for righteousness. Closing thought. Just as those biblical times needed clear spiritual vision to recognize Jesus, we too must cultivate discernment and unwavering faith to navigate a world that often distorts the truth. Walking in the light means aligning our lives with Christ, standing firm in His Word, and reflecting His love and truth in a culture that desperately needs Him. Modern application. Point number three. Economic and social justice implications. Ancient meaning. Jesus spoke against greed, exploitation, and selfishness. Many in Jesus' time suffered under economic oppression. Modern application. Modern believers are called to live generously, support the marginalized, and resist systematic injustices. Christians today must advocate for justice, whether in fair wages, ethical business practices, or fighting poverty. Practical application. Living generously. Modern Christians can practice radical generosity, giving to missions, charities, and people in need. Avoiding greed and corruption. Whether in business, politics, or church leadership, ethical integrity must guide believers' actions. Closing thought. Just as Jesus challenged the economic and social injustices of his time, we are called to reflect his heart for justice today. By living generously, upholding integrity, and advocating for the marginalized, we embody Christ's love in a world that often prioritizes wealth and power over righteousness. Walking in his way means standing for truth, serving others selflessly, and working toward a more just and compassionate society. Modern application. Point number four. Recognizing Jesus in a secular world. Ancient meaning. Luke's gospel emphasizes spiritual perception, seeing Jesus as the true light. Modern application. In a pluralistic and secular society, many reject Jesus or demand more proof. True spiritual vision comes from recognizing Christ as Lord. Practical application. Avoiding spiritual blindness. Believers must be vigilant against skepticism, cultural norms, and worldly distractions that can dim their faith. Witnessing boldly. In a world that increasingly rejects Christian values, believers must courageously point others to Jesus, the light of the world. Closing thought. Just as people in biblical times needed clear spiritual vision to recognize Jesus, we must also develop and maintain spiritual clarity in a world that often rejects him. Conclusion. Modern application. Living with a clear spiritual vision. Key lessons and application for modern Christians. The eye is the lamp of the body. What we fix our gaze upon, God's truth or worldly distractions, shapes our spiritual clarity and direction. Light versus darkness. In a world filled with moral confusion, we must actively seek truth and reject spiritual blindness. Generosity over greed. True discipleship calls for a heart of generosity rather than an obsession with material wealth. Recognizing Jesus as the light. Our spiritual health is directly tied to how clearly we see and follow Christ amidst a secular culture. Closing thought. Jesus' teaching on the eye as the lamp of the body challenges us to examine what we allow to shape our hearts and minds. Are we filling ourselves with light by focusing on God's truth, or are we allowing darkness to cloud our vision? A spiritually healthy life begins with a clear and undivided focus on Christ. Just a quick note on bibliography. A lot of the citation I have here is actually from Biblical Exegesis, a beginner's handbook, 4th edition by Hayes and Holliday. I also reference John Bergsma and the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as Plato, the Republic. A lot of the commentary and historical background was taken from Herbert Lockyer's Bible Dictionary. And then most everything else came from the Word Biblical Commentary, NIGTC, TNTL, PNTC, and Hans Dieter Betts' commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. It's too lengthy to go and give specific examples, but everything that I'm referring to is an amalgamation, and I credit everything here on this bibliography page.